The first thing that hit me was the smell of varnished wood and old paper, that courthouse scent that clings to grief like a second skin. I remember thinking I should have worn softer shoes because every step I took on those tiled floors sounded like a gavel. Guilty, guilty, guilty. I'm Maeve's 69 widow mother to one daughter I gave my entire life to. And that morning, I walked in with my spine straight, my lipstick careful, and my heart a bruised fruit I was pretending didn't ache. Dawn was already there in a dress too tight for her own conscience, whispering something into Dave's ear that made him smirk. If smug could perfume the air, he would have suffocated the room. Then it happened. The judge glanced up from the file, blinked twice, and went still, like a man remembering the exact moment lightning once chose him. He leaned forward, squinted, and murmured it under his breath first, as if testing the edges of a memory. It's her. Then louder, with the kind of awe that doesn't belong in legal proceedings, it's her. The clerks paused. The attorneys looked up. Even the clock, I swear, skipped half a second. No one in that room knew who I was anymore, least of all my daughter. But the man in robes did. And I felt the strangest thing bloom beneath my ribs, not fear, not triumph. Recognition. The world turning back to a door I had held open decades ago, when it was heavy, and everyone else was in a hurry. You don't get to that kind of moment without 1,000 small betrayals lining the road like mile markers. I used to think my story began on a gray October Thursday, when Dawn sat at my table with the crocheted runner I'd stitched during graveyard shifts and the African violets I still water at 6 sharp, because my Raphael loved them, and told me she and Dave had found a lovely community for people like me. The phrase lodged in me like a swallowed needle. People like me. I had pulled double shifts cleaning offices so she could wear a cap and gown. I had sold cupcakes at church bazaars to cover her fees when the bursar threatened late penalties. I hemmed the green dress she now wore while telling me my memories belonged in a brochure with bingo nights and a shared dining hall. Dave sprawled in my late husband's chair, remote in hand, the TV bright with a game I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears. "It's for your own good," he said, smiling with the gentleness of a wolf. That night, I sat in our kitchen with the light off and let the house breathe around me. There's a sound houses make when no one is pretending, the settling of beams, the soft tap of a heating pipe, the whisper of your name from a hallway no one walks anymore. I traced the grout lines of the tile Raphael laid when Dawn was 10 and begged to help, but mostly watched, swinging her legs and asking if we could have pancakes for dinner. He used to wipe his forehead with the back of his wrist and wink at me like we were 2 teenagers who had tricked the world into giving us a family. He left quietly, one winter, heart failing him the way men's hearts sometimes do, tired loyal organs that have carried too much for too long. The morning after the funeral, I brewed coffee in my chipped mug and whispered to those violets, "We keep going." And we did, until my own daughter measured my life in square footage and called it unsafe. They came with papers next, and a man who used the word transfer, as if my house were a call he could forward. The lawyer's pen glinted like a tooth. Dave talked about liability and risk, and Dawn. My Dawn stood by the window, eyes on her phone, nodding at every word a stranger said about her mother's mind. I asked for time. They gave me a week like mercy. The day after she arrived with boxes and put my life into them with the efficiency of a moving crew. The dress I wore to Raphael's funeral went into a donation bag. Photographs slid into cardboard faces down. When she lifted my jewelry box, I heard the small clink of a gold chain that had been my mother's and said, "Leave it," in a voice that made my own hands flinch. "It will be safer with us," she answered and tucked it into her purse like she had just done me a favor. That night, the house hummed with emptiness. I made tea and forgot to add sugar, then took a sip and didn't spit it out because bitterness felt honest for once. I won't lie to you, I almost surrendered. There is a fatigue particular to women of my age, the fatigue of being told you are fragile right when you are the strongest you've ever been. But I am my mother's daughter and my husband's wife. I opened drawers looking for a small mercy, a letter, a note, a reason to keep my chin straight until morning. In Raphael's desk, where we kept the dull things of living stamps, rubber bands, warranties for appliances we no longer owned, I found the folder. A small key tucked into a book about long-term investments like a secret handshake. The lock clicked open with a sound so soft it seemed to apologize. I didn't know the law, not the way the men in suits claim to, but I know a signature when I see one. I know dates. I know love disguised as paperwork. He had left me the things I never thought to ask for. Not just the house. Buildings I didn't know bore his name. Stocks no one had bragged about at Christmas, but quietly fed themselves into a future he wanted for me. A letter in his slanted hand, calling me my brave girl, and confessing his suspicion of Dave, the way a father notices when a man looks at his daughter, the way you look at a locked door and a set of keys. Use this not to hurt, he wrote, but to protect and to teach. I sat on the floor with my knees aching and cried into that paper as if it could hold me back. By Monday, they arrived with movers dressed for the performance of benevolence. I served myself tea at my own table and let them talk the way you let rain talk to a roof you know won't leak. When I told them I owned the building they lived in, Dawn's mouth opened and closed like a fish taken too fast from water. Dave laughed, then didn't. I showed deeds without theatrics, the way you show a child the rule book after they've insisted a game doesn't have one. They tried every door, manipulation, pity threats. I stood still. Sometimes standing still is the most complicated choreography there is. You want to know about the courtroom, about the judge who froze and said, "It's her." 30 years ago, I was a secretary in family court with worn heels and a thermos that always smelled faintly of cinnamon. I watched boys with thin ties try to disappear behind their folders when partners barked saw women with voices like ice-cut clerks to the quick. There was a young intern then, awkward, brilliant, uninvited to most tables, who I made room for at mine. I never thought kindness could return with a gavel in its hand. But that morning, when Dawn rolled her eyes and Dave squared his shoulders to enjoy the spectacle of me being flayed, the man behind the bench looked at me like a son looks at a porch light left on. The room didn't know it yet, but the ground had shifted. And for once, in this long, humiliating season, it shifted under someone else's feet. He said my name like a vow, like the syllables themselves had pulled him through some hard winter I never knew he'd had. For a moment, I was 29 again, shoes pinching hair coming loose from a barrette as I stayed late to fix a file no one else believed worth fixing. I had made coffee that night for a young intern whose hands shook when he stapled. He'd thanked me as if caffeine were absolution. Now he wore a robe and the quiet gravity of a man who had carried hundreds of stories through to their ends. I felt my throat close. I managed a nod. It was enough. Dave's attorney recovered first. He had that polished cruelty some men learn at country clubs. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and painted me with words meddling, manipulative, controlling. He said elderly in a tone that meant inconvenient. He described a daughter with a loving husband, a mother unable to accept boundaries. He held up printouts of my texts. "Are you coming Sunday? I made soup. How are you feeling?" He said they were evidence of harassment. Dawn kept her eyes on her lap hands, clasped knuckles a little too white for a woman listening to the truth. When Victoria, my lawyer, bright-eyed, measured, and ruthless in the way that only women who have had to be twice as prepared can be stood up, she didn't button her jacket. She let the silence stretch until even the fluorescent lights seemed to clear their throats. Then she placed one piece of paper on the lectern. "Your Honor," she said softly, "before we talk about manipulation, we should talk about signatures." She handed up the form Dave had filed to start the proceedings, to have me declared incompetent. The physician's letter attached claimed I was forgetful, volatile, confused. It was dated a day my primary care doctor had been out of state at a conference. I could see the moment the judge recognized the telltale tremor of a trace signature. He tilted his head and sighed through his nose the way men do when a disappointment feels like a bruise on their own reputations. Victoria didn't lift her voice. She stacked evidence slowly like bricks. The building deed with my name. The corporate filings that made me a significant shareholder, where Dave served as a mid-level manager, a fact he had left out of course while lecturing me about financial responsibility. Voicemails where his tone changed from honey to gravel. "Convince your mother to sign, or I'm done." Texts in which he called me an old liability. A recording not hidden. He'd left the voicemail in a moment of careless rage in which he told someone I was ripe for a guardianship. When she played that clip, the file's tinny speaker made his contempt sound even smaller, like pettiness boiled down to its cough syrup thickest self. "Mrs. Williams," Judge Morales said, and the title landed on me like a shawl I hadn't realized I missed. "Would you like to speak?" I stood. My knees complained, but pride was louder. "I baked dumplings the day they told me I was moving." I began, unexpected even to myself, how grief chooses the doorway it enters through. "They've always been Dawn's favorite." I stitched the runner on the table when I worked nights to pay for her AP exam fees. "The tiles, everyone says, are old-fashioned. My husband's hand set them. He worried the grout would crack in winter and went out with a hairdryer because he was certain he could coax the cold into being kind. I know the law will have its say, but I need the court to hear this love is not incompetence. Sacrifice is not pathology. And boundaries do not include putting your mother's life into a banker's box and calling it care." For a second, all you could hear was the AC kissing the vents. Dave's lawyer coughed. Dawn's shoulders shook once so small I would have missed it if I hadn't been watching her the way mothers do 1,000 miles an hour, 1,000 miles away. Then the judge did something I wouldn't have imagined. He took off his glasses, set them on the bench, and in front of a courtroom full of strangers, told a story about a secretary who had slipped him a granola bar in a hallway when he was 23, and living on black coffee and fear. "You told me," he said, looking at me as if that day were not a lifetime ago, "that people deserve to be seen in the most ordinary part of their day, not just in their worst. I have never forgotten it." He cleared his throat, the robe resettling around him, the man stepping back into the bench. "We will proceed under the law. But let it be known for the record the court recognizes Ms. Williams's decades of service and character." Victoria called our first witness, the building manager, who testified to Dave demanding access and threatening police when Dawn told him she didn't want to see him. A neighbor spoke about the afternoon she'd heard shouting through Dawn's door the words, "If you loved me, you'd pick me over her," etched into the hallway like graffiti. We had bank statements and affidavits. We had a letter from my doctor stating I could probably run my block's HOA if I wanted to. We had Dawn's text to me the night she took my mother's chain, the one that said, "For your safety," and nothing else. At some point, my daughter lifted her chin. She looked not at Dave, but at the judge, and for the first time, I heard her voice clear of his cadence. "Your Honor," she said, "I need to say something difficult." Victoria tried to touch her sleeve to pull her back into the tidy lanes of strategy, but Dawn shook her head. "I allowed myself to be turned into someone I don't recognize," she continued. "I told myself I was protecting my mother because it was easier than admitting I was protecting my marriage. I took her jewelry. I packed her life into boxes. I want my daughter," and there it was, the softest secret said aloud. She put a hand to her dress without meaning to. Dave flinched as if he'd been slapped to grow up, seeing me stand up, not go along. "I don't cry easily anymore." Grief has a way of teaching your face to behave. But a tear slid down and cooled on the corner of my lip, tasting like salt and lemon, and a beginning you don't yet have the courage to name. Dave stood so quickly, his chair scraped. "Your Honor, she's pregnant. This is a ploy to make me look cruel. I am the stable parent. Her mother is wealthy and vindictive and—" "Sit down, Mr. Foster," the judge said with that particular judicial boredom that is more devastating than anger. When he finished speaking, Dave sat. The ruling that day was not the final one the law likes its steps in order, but it was the kind of temporary order that tells you where the wind lives. The petition to declare me incompetent was dismissed with prejudice. The court granted a protective order, keeping Dave from contacting either of us outside counsel. Temporary support was set not for him, but for Dawn, and the judge scheduled a hearing that would take a real bite out of Dave's swagger. I watched his shoulders hunch inward, a man who had lost his favorite mirror. We walked out into winter sunlight that felt odd on the back of my neck, like a hand I didn't trust yet. Dawn took my elbow. "I don't deserve your kindness," she whispered. "You don't have it yet," I answered, and watched relief and remorse cross her face like clouds. That night, the house felt less haunted. I brewed tea and didn't forget the sugar. Dawn sat at the table and tried to fold the counsel's packet into some kind of order. Papers slid like birds refusing cages. "I can go back to work part-time," she said. "Victoria says the court will look at that favorably. I can cut expenses. We can sell." "No," I said gently, and her eyes flicked up. "We will not begin your new life by selling off pieces to pay for the damage he did. There is a difference between consequence and penance. One teaches, the other grinds." She nodded, and something unclenched in my chest, a fist that had been clamping shut for months. Dave didn't go quietly. Men like him rarely do. He filed motions with new adjectives. He left a message one night drunk enough to let the tail of his accent slip, calling me a parasite on my own daughter. He tried to turn the people in his office into a Greek chorus. It turns out HR reports sound different when they land on a desk with my name on the shareholder line. He sent a cousin to collect some things from the apartment. The cousin left after the building manager, a small woman with a voice like a violin string pulled tight, read him the restraining order out loud without blinking. And then he went lower. A fake Facebook account with a profile picture of an angel holding a flaming sword. Message Dawn, repent, return to your husband. Honor thy mother, except he meant me, in a way that turned the commandment on its head. He posted, I was a witch. He posted, I was stealing an unborn child. He posted the address of my house and men who call themselves patriots, but were so very bored, knocked on my door and shouted that the family is sacred. I didn't answer. I called Victoria. She called the detective she's always polite to. The knock stopped like someone had cut a wire. On the morning of the next hearing, a thin envelope slid under my door with my mail. Inside, a photograph. Me at my sink, my back turned, the violets floating in their saucers like small boats. The note said, "You don't deserve that house." Rage is a hot thing usually. This was cold, the kind of chill that makes your gums ache. I took the photo to the bench. Judge Morales looked at it, and that quiet gravity deepened into something like winter. He made a phone call from the bench. The bailiff's gaze sharpened. The day bent toward consequence. The best part, though, the part I won't pretend didn't taste like honey and lightning together, was the last 10 minutes of that hearing when the judge asked Dave to explain the physician's letter with the trace signature. He tried to laugh it off. He tried to say he'd been misled. He tried to say the clinic had made an error. Which clinic, the judge asked. Name the physician, spell the name. Dave swallowed. He guessed wrong. It was like watching a man try to sprint through a door that had quietly been bricked up overnight. The judge's voice never rose. It didn't have to. After out on the courthouse steps, Dawn cried into my shoulder in a way that was not a child's collapse, but a woman's unfastening. I thought revenge would feel like fireworks, she said into the wool of my coat, embarrassed by her own hunger for spectacle. But this feels like justice. Like finally the grown-ups came home. Sometimes revenge is just the truth with good lighting, I told her, surprised by my own line and a little proud of it. She laughed, hiccuped, wiped her cheeks. We walked to the bus stop because humility is a muscle, and I was still learning how to flex it without flinching. I carried the photograph of my violets in my purse like a talisman, not of threat, but of the place I would not yield. At night, I lay awake and rehearsed the future like a speech. Boundaries that weren't brittle. Doors I would leave unlocked only for kindness. A nursery we would paint together, if she wanted to stay, until she could afford a place where sunlight knew her name. I made a list, on a sticky note, locksmith motion sensor lights call the nonprofit about elder housing rights. Yes, even now, after the storm, other women. Because what is the point of a victory you keep in a velvet bag where it cannot touch a single soul? I slept with the letter from Raphael under my pillow for a week like a teenager would. Use this not to hurt, but to protect and to teach. When Dawn asked me in the blue hush before dawn if I thought she could be a good mother, I told her the truth I'd learned at last the hard way. Being a good mother isn't about never failing. It's about never letting your failures be the last word. We showed up to the next hearing with our hair brushed and our bones steady. Dave showed up with a new suit and the same old eyes. The judge turned a page. Dave looked small. I thought of the folder with the key hidden in a book, of a granola bar in a hallway, of a kitchen tile my husband warmed with a hairdryer like prayer. There are threads that run through years braided by hands you barely remember. That day, I could feel them in my palms like reins. The bailiff called order, though the room had already quieted into that charged hush before a storm breaks. Dave's lawyer rose words lined up like soldiers on his tongue, ready to march. But the judge's hand lifted palm outward, and the lawyer sat as if tugged by a string. Morales's eyes were fixed on Dave, not with anger, but with something worse, disappointment, the kind that cracks pride more deeply than rage ever could. Mr. Foster, the judge, said, his voice low, but carrying, I gave you opportunities to present your case with honesty. Instead, I find myself looking at falsified medical documentation, at threats disguised as care, and at evidence of coercion against your wife and her mother. His tone was measured, but every word landed like a gavel. Dave tried to interrupt, stammering about misunderstandings, about being painted unfairly. But Morales leaned forward, and the room leaned with him. Enough. This court is not a place for performance. It is a place for truth. And the truth here is painful, but it is clear. My breath snagged. Beside me, Dawn squeezed my hand so tightly, her knuckles went white. I could feel the tremor running through her. For years, she had let Dave's voice drown hers out, but now she was standing tall, letting mine anchor her. The judge declared that custody would remain solely with Dawn, that I was not incompetent, and that restraining orders would be enforced with zero tolerance. He ordered Dave to undergo an independent psychological evaluation before any further petitions could even be entertained. And then, with a pause long enough to hang heavy in every corner of the room, he said, This court strongly advises Mr. Foster to consider the consequences of his actions not only in legal terms, but in the legacy he will leave behind. Because one day, his child will ask about this moment. And children deserve the truth. The gavel came down sharp as thunder. Dave's shoulders collapsed inward. For the first time, I saw not arrogance, not rage, but fear. He looked at Dawn, perhaps hoping for one last tether, but she turned her face away. That tiny gesture, her refusing his gaze, was louder than any verdict. We walked out of the courthouse into air so bright it hurt. Reporters had gathered word having spread about the case, but their questions blurred into background noise. Dawn and I didn't answer. We walked past them like two women stepping out of a cage, leaving the lock to rust behind us. That night, the house smelled of stew simmering slow on the stove. Dawn stirred absent-mindedly, her hand resting on her belly. "Mom," she whispered. "I thought I'd feel broken after all this, but somehow I feel lighter." I reached over and smoothed her hair the way I had when she was a little girl. That's because the truth always weighs less than lies. Even when it hurts, it lets you breathe. Later, when she went to bed, I sat alone with my tea. I traced my fingers over the folder Raphael had left me, over the letter that had carried me through these months. My husband had known. He had seen the storm coming and left me an umbrella strong enough to withstand it. But the real strength hadn't been in the money or the documents, it had been in remembering who I was, even when my own child forgot. I looked out at the garden where the African violets bloomed under the porch light, steady and stubborn. And for the first time in so long, I didn't feel like a woman on the edge of being erased. I felt like the keeper of my own story. The trial was over, but my journey wasn't. Dawn had miles of repentance to walk. Dave had his own shadows to answer to, and I had wounds that would never fully close. Yet in that moment, I understood something I'd almost forgotten. Dignity isn't given. It's reclaimed. The weeks after the trial were both quiet and strange. For so long, my days had been filled with dread, waiting for knocks on the door letters from lawyers, whispered threats. Suddenly, there was none of that. The silence was almost too much to bear, as if my body hadn't yet learned how to live without fear. Dawn moved back into the house, and though she kept her room tidy and helped with chores, I could sense her walking on eggshells around me. She wanted to mend what had been broken, but trust isn't rebuilt overnight. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with tears brimming, as if she wanted to apologize again, but didn't know how to shape the words. Other times, I saw her smiling faintly when serenity kicked inside her belly, and it was in those moments I remembered why I hadn't shut the door on her completely. One evening, we were sitting at the kitchen table. The stew simmered on the stove, and the house smelled of garlic and rosemary. Dawn reached across the table, her hand hovering before mine, as if asking for permission. "Mom," she whispered, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to be worthy of it. Please give me time." I looked at her hand, then at her eyes, and I thought of the girl she had been, the one who once clung to my apron strings, who cried when she scraped her knees, who said I was her whole world. I placed my hand over hers. "Time is all we have, Dawn. Use it well." That night, I went to bed lighter. Maybe not healed, but no longer bleeding. But life has a way of testing you even when you think the storm has passed. One morning, as I was watering the African violets, I noticed a black car idling outside the house. The windows were tinted, but I knew. Dave wasn't gone. He was circling, watching, waiting for another chance to strike. A chill ran through me, but I stood straighter. Let him watch. I had already faced him in court and come out stronger. He couldn't take my house. He couldn't take my dignity. And he would never again take my daughter's soul. When Serenity was born, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to lift just a little. Holding that tiny life in my arms, I realized that revenge and justice are different things. Revenge leaves you empty, but justice leaves you free. Still, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning of another chapter 1, where forgiveness, boundaries, and dignity would walk beside me like old companions. The day we brought Serenity home was the first time in months the house felt alive again. Her cries filled the quiet rooms, sharp but honest like bells that reminded us there was still something pure to live for. I cradled her in my arms while Dawn unpacked the tiny clothes folded neatly in drawers that used to hold her own baby dresses. Life had folded over on itself like pages touching after decades apart. Dawn was different now. Motherhood carved a new softness into her face, but also a resilience I had long prayed she would find. She woke at dawn to feed Serenity humming lullabies I had once sung to her. Sometimes I lingered by her door listening, remembering the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap. It was as if I was being given a second chance, not to erase the past, but to rewrite its ending. Still, shadows lingered. One afternoon, as I returned from the market, I saw Dave standing across the street. His hair was unkempt, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes burning with something darker than anger, desperation. He didn't shout, didn't cross the road, just stood there watching the house that no longer welcomed him. I walked past him with my head-high groceries steady in my hands. Inside, my knees trembled, but I refused to let him see fear. When I told Dawn, she pressed Serenity closer to her chest and whispered, "He can't hurt us anymore, Mom. Not with you here." The months passed, and Serenity grew, her laughter echoing through the garden as she learned to crawl, then toddle on unsteady legs. Dawn and I planted new violets together, a ritual of rebirth. The house, once stripped of warmth, was alive again, smelling of baby powder broth and forgiveness. But the past still called to me at night. I would sit in Raphael's chair, holding his letter, reading the lines over and over. Not to hurt, but to protect and to teach. He had trusted me with more than wealth, he had trusted me with wisdom. I realized then that my story wasn't just about surviving betrayal. It was about showing Dawn, and now Serenity, that dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you defend, even when your voice shakes. And so, I began to dream bigger. I reached out to a local community center offering funds to start a program for elderly women abandoned or mistreated by their families. I knew too well the silence of that pain, and I wanted to build a place where it could be broken. Each time I stood before those women telling pieces of my story, I felt Raphael beside me, nodding, whispering, "Yes, Maeve. This is why I left it all to you." One evening, while Serenity napped and Dawn sat with me on the porch, she turned and said softly, "Mom, you didn't just save me. You saved who I was meant to be." Her words settled in my chest like balm on a wound. I looked at her, at the twilight painting her face in shades of forgiveness, and I finally believed it. We were healing. The weeks after the trial slipped into a rhythm of quiet healing. Some days felt unbearably heavy, as if the silence left behind by Dave's threats pressed into every corner of the house. Other days felt light and hopeful, filled with the sound of Serenity's tiny giggles echoing against the kitchen walls, while Dawn and I cooked side by side. Dawn worked hard to rebuild trust. She no longer brushed off chores or hid behind excuses. She made tea for me every morning, folding laundry without being asked, and even began writing in a small journal about her feelings, a habit she said helped her see her mistakes more clearly. There were moments when I caught her gazing at Serenity with tears in her eyes, whispering, "I'll never let you feel what I made Grandma feel." Those whispers weren't meant for me, but I heard them, and they pierced me in a way words never had. Still, the past lingered like a shadow in the corners. One night, as I sat with my tea and Raphael's old letters, I found Dawn standing in the doorway. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling, "will you ever truly forgive me?" I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip, it's a slow, grinding work of the heart. I'll forgive you the day I stop waking up to the memory of you packing my life into boxes, I said softly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Then I'll wait, she whispered. As weeks turned into months, Dave lurked less and less. Rumors trickled in. He had lost his job, his debts piled up, and his arrogance had turned to bitterness. Once, I saw him across the street, disheveled and hollow-eyed, but this time he didn't speak. He only looked at Serenity through the window, with something between longing and rage, before disappearing into the night. That was the last time I ever saw him. Meanwhile, Dawn and I built something new. We started attending community meetings together, offering help to women who had been abandoned or betrayed by their families. Sharing my story, our story was painful, but it gave others courage. And each time I saw Dawn listening intently, her hand on Serenity's head, I realized she wasn't just hearing me. She was learning. One crisp autumn morning, as we hung laundry in the yard, Dawn turned to me and said, "Mom, you were right. Dignity isn't given, it's defended. I'll make sure Serenity knows that from the start." The sun caught her face, and for the first time in years, I saw the girl I had raised, not the stranger Dave had molded. In that moment, I knew healing wasn't just possible, it was already happening. Winter came, and with it, long evenings where the three of us, Dawn, Serenity, and I, huddled together by the fireplace. The baby was growing fast, her laughter brighter than any flame. Sometimes she would toddle to the mantel where I kept Raphael's photo and point with her tiny finger, babbling. I liked to believe she felt his presence too, but beneath the warmth of those nights, scars still ached. Forgiveness isn't a blanket you can wrap around everything. It has holes. I still woke some mornings with the echo of Dave's threats in my ears, or the sting of Dawn's cold words when she told me memories belonged in the heart, not on the walls. I couldn't forget, but I was learning how to live alongside the pain. One evening, Dawn sat across from me with Serenity asleep in her arms. The firelight made her look older, more fragile. "Mom," she said softly, "do you ever wonder why Dad left all that power to you instead of splitting it between us?" I studied her carefully. "Because he knew money reveals hearts. He wanted to see yours." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "And you showed him Dawn. Not at first, but eventually. You chose to break free." Tears welled in her eyes, and for once she didn't try to hide them. "I don't deserve this second chance," she whispered. "No one deserves a second chance," I replied gently. "It's not earned. It's lived. What you do from here, that's what matters." As months passed, our house became more than just a home. It became a refuge. Women from the community center began visiting, seeking advice, tea, sometimes just a listening ear. They sat at our table, sharing stories of betrayal, neglect, and abandonment. And every time I told mine, I saw Dawn's shoulders straighten a little more, as though she too was gathering strength from it. One afternoon, after the women had gone, Dawn hugged me tightly. "Mom," she said, "maybe we could turn this into something bigger. Not just a house, but a place where women like you, like us, can come and rebuild." Her words lit something in me. It was as if Raphael's letter, my tears, and all the pain we had endured were finally blooming into purpose. That night, with Serenity nestled between us, we sketched out ideas on a notepad. A foundation, a safe place, a legacy built from broken pieces. For the first time in years, I didn't just feel like I had survived. I felt like I was beginning again. Spring unfurled, slowly painting our garden in fresh greens and soft blossoms. Serenity toddled barefoot across the grass, chasing butterflies with squeals of laughter. Every time I saw her tiny hands reaching for the sky, I thought of the nights I had nearly given up, of the humiliation of being told I was too old, too weak, too useless. And then I thought of this, her joy, Dawn's renewed strength, the peace I had fought tooth and nail to reclaim. The foundation became more than a dream. Dawn threw herself into it with a kind of devotion I hadn't seen in her for years. She made phone calls, drafted proposals, even attended community meetings where she spoke about what she had learned. At first, her voice shook, but as weeks passed, it grew steadier. Watching her speak about dignity and resilience, I felt a deep ache in my chest, not of pain, but of pride. Our living room turned into a planning hub, papers and notebooks stacked high. Some nights we stayed up late, Serenity asleep in her crib, while we argued over names for the project. Home and dignity, Dawn finally said, her hand resting over mine. "Because that's what you gave back to me, Mom." The first house we opened was small, just a renovated duplex with room for 6 women. But when I walked through the doors on opening day, saw the fresh coats of paint, the handmade quilts on the beds, the shelves lined with books, I thought my heart might burst. Women arrived slowly at first, quiet, broken eyes filled with shame. But within weeks the house buzzed with life, with laughter, with the smell of stews and fresh bread. I remember one woman, Clara, a widow abandoned by her own children. She held my hands, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "You saved me." I thought my story was over. I squeezed her fingers tight and told her the truth. We saved each other. Still, not all shadows were gone. Occasionally, news of Dave would drift back to us, rumors of debts, of failed jobs, of him leaving town in disgrace. Dawn would tense at the mention of his name, her hands tightening protectively over Serenity. And I would remind her his chapter in our story is finished. Don't reread what almost destroyed you. As the seasons turned, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Raphael's foresight, my pain, Dawn's repentance, Serenity's laughter. All of it had woven together into something far greater than I had imagined. And one quiet evening, as the sun set behind the violets in my garden, Dawn leaned against me and whispered, "Mom, I think this is what Dad meant in his letter. Not to hurt, but to protect. Not to punish, but to teach." I kissed the crown of her head and smiled through tears. Yes, Dawn, and we're finally living it. Summer arrived with long golden evenings, and with it came the second house for our foundation. This one was bigger, with space for 15 women and a small playground where their grandchildren could visit. On the day of the inauguration, I stood in front of the fresh white walls, my hands trembling, not from weakness, but from awe. A lifetime ago, I had been a widow, betrayed, and stripped of dignity in my own home. Now, I was cutting a ribbon that opened doors for women who once felt as invisible as I had. Dawn spoke that day too. She stood in a lavender dress, her voice steady as she held Serenity in her arms. I once lost sight of what family meant, she admitted to the crowd. But because of my mother's strength and her refusal to give up on me, I found my way back. This house isn't just for women, it's for daughters too, so they can learn what love and dignity truly mean. Her words cut through me like sunlight. For the first time in years, I felt my daughter was not just beside me, she was with me. Life wasn't perfect. Forgiveness was still a daily choice, not a finished task. Sometimes late at night, when I heard the wind rattle the windows, I remembered the day Dawn packed my life into boxes, or Dave's sneer when he called me a manipulative old woman. Those memories didn't vanish, but they no longer held me hostage. They were scars, reminders of battles survived. One evening, as I tucked Serenity into bed, She grabbed my finger with her tiny hand and whispered, "Love you, Grandma." My throat tightened. I kissed her forehead and thought, this is the true inheritance I will leave her. Not just houses, not just money, but proof that dignity can be defended even when the world calls you powerless. Weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Judge Morales, the same man whose eyes had filled with recognition in that courtroom. He was retiring, and he wrote, "Mrs. Maeve, your courage reminded me why I chose justice all those years ago. I would like to honor you at the closing of my career, so future generations of lawyers know the weight of kindness and dignity." I held the letter against my chest, tears running freely. I wasn't just a grandma anymore. I was living proof that no betrayal, no humiliation, no courtroom could erase a woman's worth. The day of Judge Morales's retirement ceremony arrived like a circle closing. Dawn and I dressed carefully, she in a pale blue dress, me in the same black suit I had worn to the trial. Serenity wore a white ribbon in her hair, her little hands clutching mine as we entered the courthouse that had once been filled with humiliation and fear. This time, the air felt different. There was reverence, respect, and even admiration. When the judge took the podium, his voice carried through the room with a calm authority. In my years of service, I have seen laws bent, twisted, and rewritten. But I have also seen people who embody true justice without ever wearing a robe. Today, I want to honor one such person, Maeve Williams. My heart pounded as the audience turned toward me. 30 years ago, when I was an insecure intern, she was the only one who believed in me. And decades later, she reminded me again that justice is not about power, it's about dignity. Applause erupted, but I barely heard it. Dawn was crying silently beside me, her hand gripping mine. When I stood to receive the plaque, I saw Raphael in my mind's eye, smiling that quiet smile of his. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me, no older than Dawn had been when she first left home. "Mrs. Williams," she said shyly, "I'm studying law and your story. It gives me hope. My own family doesn't believe in me, but hearing what you've endured makes me think I can keep going." I hugged her tightly because I knew too well the weight of disbelief. That evening, back home, we sat around the dinner table. Serenity babbled over her mashed potatoes. Dawn laughed softly, and for once there was no shadow in the room. Just peace. I realized then that revenge hadn't been my true victory. Karma had played its hand. Yes, Dave had destroyed himself. But the deeper triumph was this: I had turned betrayal into purpose, humiliation, into strength loss, into legacy. Looking at Dawn and Serenity, I finally felt it in my bones. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. And Raphael's letter had been right all along. True power lies not in hurting, but in teaching, in protecting, in transforming pain into something that outlives you. If you've stayed with me through my story, I ask you now, don't just leave quietly. Share this with someone who needs strength. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far this story of survival, dignity, and redemption can reach. Because maybe my story can light the way for someone else still trapped in the dark.